And we returned for more coverage of the FIDE Corporate Chess Championship. Sam, we had an exciting first round. You and I were talking during the break there. Many great games, right?
Absolutely. There are so many games. We were kind of plowing through Chess.com events, trying to find some real gems to show you. And there are a lot. There are just so many games being played in this event. Of course, there are going to be some gems. And of course, it's going to be really hard to find all of them in the moment. But we're looking forward to kind of diving into some exciting moments right now.
And well, there's no better person's chess to dive into than Magnus Carlsen to have this game up and ready for our viewers. You were excited about this one because it started with a King's Gambit, where white on the second move puts the pawn in f4. So Sam, you take the wheel. I mean, this game was fascinating one indeed. And this knight c6 move, you were starting to talk to me about some of the complications.
Absolutely. The King's Gambit is a sickness that I have suffered from for a long time. I really enjoy playing it as white, partially just because it's the King's Gambit. It's like the most romantic opening you can play. And I know Magnus Carlsen has played it at the top level before, at least in, I think, like the Norway Blitz chess tournament. So I've had to look at his games because everyone else who's defending against my King's Gambit is. Here he's playing it obviously against an opponent who he outrates significantly, who's rated like 1400. And I love that, right? He's giving his opponent an experience. He knows he's probably going to win the game. I mean, probably being 99.9999999% certainty, but he's here to play like the opera game. He's here to play romantic chess and to go in for a slugfest against his opponent. And I love that. I think that's the spirit you want from the world champion in an event like this. And the knight c6 line is interesting here. Here after knight c6, if we can advance in this position, after the capture on e5 in just a moment, there is d6, but black has knight takes e5 in this position. And white is still better, but this can get really complicated because white can take on e5 here, and then black has queen h4 check. And the move that you would never, ever in a million years want to play is king up to e2, which we should put on the board, when queen takes e4 is checkmate. So you're not going to get that against Magnus Carlsen, but it's fun to see that checkmate on the board. So instead, black has to play g3 after the check on h4. And then after queen takes on e4 check, the rook on h1 is dropping after queen e2 and queen takes h1. And then white wins the rook on h8 with knight g6 check, and then knight takes h8, which is just insane. The computer is like, maybe white's better. Maybe this is just insane. I don't know. Of course, playing in this fashion against the world champion would be really incredible. Not impossible because it is kind of a theoretical line. And if you've kind of looked at this idea with knight c6, you might know this as a 1400 player. Of course, this didn't happen, but that's why we love the King's Gambit. That's why we love seeing world champion Carlsen playing the King's Gambit, because of these kinds of ideas and lines. And I'm sure that Magnus would also have loved to kind of see this on the board and have this kind of rich position against his opponent.
For sure. And, this one did not capture an e5. It's a hard move to play if you don't know it. It's a knight sacrifice, right? It looks like you're just making a blunder, but there's this h4 score. Whenever you see an f pawn missing in the opening, you think about that check on the king. And so that's why knight takes e5 was playable. But instead, Sam, we saw d6, and Magnus took over the center with d4. And once you establish this pawn center and you don't lose a pawn, but in fact win a pawn,
right,
it was kind of overwhelming at this point. And the player did his best to try to hold him off, but you see, look at this well-established center here, and one of those pawns is an extra one.
Right. Not a lot of chances to come back against the world champion from this point on, but you got to play the world champion. I mean, that is literally a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So I think that all of us here in the chat can be jealous here of Santosh. He got to go in, he got to play the world champion, and that's fantastic.
Yeah, and I'm just playing through the moves so we can just see the game. And that was pretty much the final straws. After queen c5, this bishop is under attack, and the bishop would probably have to take this knight on f3. Instead, the knight was dropped back to e7, and down goes the bishop. So now you're down 2 pawns and a piece, and Magnus finishes in style. He brings his knight out for the checkmating attack on h7. h6 is played, stopping that. But look, knight takes f7, removing the guard. This knight on g6 is only defended once. It's attacked twice, but this knight on g5 is also threatened. So knight takes f7, a really nice way to finish this game. Queen h7 mate, the king is boxed in. So Magnus Carlsen wins. The opening could have been quite electric, but still, I would say a nice fight from a player who saw an opponent with double the rating.
Double the rating, to say the least. Of course, I think once you hear the title World Chess Champion, and of course every player in this event at every level knows who Magnus Carlsen is. Like, you're not counting the rating anymore. You're just like, oh my God, I'm getting to play World Champion Magnus Carlsen. So we've got a lot more games, and some that were obviously a little closer. So there were some mismatches in round one, as happens in basically every tournament, and certainly a big tournament like this. But there were still some, titled versus titled matchups and some really beautiful games.
Yeah, I'm pulling this one up here by Pragnananda, who is one of the biggest talents, the brightest talents that the world has right now, from India. And he's playing on Thibaut Venenbusch, who is an international master from Belgium. And in this position, the IM with the black pieces, Venenbusch, has a better position. You see the evaluation bar here. And the move to play was queen to h6, which gives up control of the f file. That looks not great, but it saves the king, because after queen e8, rook f7, in comes an attack. And unfortunately for black, he saw nothing better than to give up the queen, and that's a queen for just the rook. You see the eval bar shoot up. But instead, there was one last defensive effort, Sam, and it was this move, knight h6, stopping checkmate, right? Stopping checkmate. The knight is hanging for free, but that queen needs to stay defending this rook on f7. So the queen can't just take the knight. Instead, you throw in the move rook takes bishop, queen takes rook, and then you take the knight. And white's position still looks very promising to me, but it's a complicated one. It's a rook for a couple minor pieces. Black has an extra pawn in the start, and this a4 pawn is hanging, so at least it would have been a fight. And that was the one last effort that Venenbusch could have played to stay in this game.
That's really, really beautiful. I saw the eval saying that it was still balanced, and I was like, how can you defend? Like h6, queen g6 looks over. Knight h6 is a really beautiful defensive effort. And of course, queen h6 before that is also really instructive as an idea. We saw in the game between Anish Giri and Nihal Sarin, where Sarin had white and was pressing. Sarin, appear with Ramesh Babu, Pragnananda here. Anish went queen g5, right as Sarin went for pawn to h5. And this is a very similar idea. You're under pressure. That rook on f3 is obviously taking up a threatening stance, and you've got to go for the queen trade. And Anish did, and he managed to draw against his tough young opponent. And unfortunately, in this case, Thibaut did not, and his opponent got the better of him in this game.
Yes. So it was a win here for white because of this missed opportunity, but it was a true fight, and time trouble can do some bad things to your chess. And it wasn't enough time remaining, I guess, for Venenbusch to fend off this attack. And Sam, I pulled up a game between some of our low-rated contestants because I saw a really nice checkmate. And here in this position, we have Ashish Gupta with the white pieces taking on Armana Libridova. And I was just going through the games, and I said, this is a really nice finish because white is up a couple pieces here, and the queen on h5 is in a menacing stance, but sometimes you have to be deliberate. Other times, if you're slow, black can fend off the checkmating attack. So the great move, seeing that you want to land your queen on h7 and you have a bishop on d3, the move play was knight f6 check, getting rid of the knight's block of this bishop. So then after the queen takes or whatever happens, king h8 was played, queen takes h7 is checkmate no matter what. So I thought that was just a nice little tactic to show.
Very, very classic. Of course, many of us will have fallen victim to such a tactic or hopefully been on the winning side in many, many cases. Extremely traditional here to kind of set up this battery against h7 and then to need the discovery to get the bishop in the game right here. Very sharp right, of course, from the white player.
For sure. And Sam, I'm going to let you take the wheel in the next game that we prepared because you were really excited when we were trying to find games. You said this Bergadzi game. That was the one that caught your attention. So let's go to that one because I have the moment pulled up here. White seems to be completely winning. I mean, the engine says plus almost 10. And there was a really wild sequence here. So why don't you take the wheel and explain what happened?
So first off, I should mention that Bergadze, I think, is board one for one of the top teams here in I want to say Group D. Forgive me if I'm wrong about that group. And I think that's PayPal Hungary. We were mentioning earlier that they're one of the favorites. In this game here, he played the move knight to d6, which is just thrilling because he is sacrificing the queen with check and sacrificing the pawn on f2 with check. So after knight d6, we get bishop takes c2, king takes c2, and queen takes f2, and the king steps out now. And now there's huge pressure against the bishop on g7 and ideas of mating with the combination of the rooks on the g file and the knight getting included as well. Knight's coming to e4, maybe a knight coming into f6, and there's like Arabian mates and all these things. But you guys also see the eval bar and that there's actually a defense here. And the only defense is knight h7, which I think is just a brilliant defensive move, like 2 exclamation points. You give up the bishop here on g7, and the idea is knight g5, splitting the rooks, and black is actually winning here because the rook on g1 is under attack and the rook on g7 is now under attack. And white's attacking coordination has been broken very, very beautifully. Now, in the game, black didn't find this amazing idea of knight h7, knight g5, and instead, white actually went on to win the game very beautifully.
Yes, because the queen dropped back to defend, knight e4 attack, as you said. Queen comes back, and look at these knights just on the light squares, piling up on this bishop on g7, and it was a checkmate in just a few moves at the rook g7. Knight takes h6, and this is kind of a sad thing to see. You're up a queen for a rook and a knight, and yet you can't stop that knight f7 check.
It's a beautiful, beautiful position for the white pieces right here.
Seriously, that queen sacrifice is something that I wouldn't even consider. And sometimes it doesn't work out. We saw the evaluation bar. Black should have been ahead. But just to have that creativity, and I'm going to go back to that position once more, to play a move like knight to d6 in this position, it may not be necessary. White was winning. But I always praise that kind of creativity because you will win games like this with knight to d6. You also, I guess, can lose a game based on a miscalculation, but ultimately just to have that in your mind, to sack your queen with check, what a wonderful tactical sequence.
I mean, as you say, I would never have considered it. I mean, knight d6, maybe I could consider sacking my queen with check, but then to realize also that black is going to have queen takes f2 with check, getting out of the kind of tempo on the queen on f7. You know, this is where my calculation stops and I go, okay, new line. I need something different. So this is just incredibly creative. And I think that this beautiful resource of knight h7, knight g5, the only saving resource for black, the fact that this exists does not for me diminish the creativity from Bragazza here. And beautiful idea, beautiful play, beautiful final position.
I agree completely because knight h7 is such a difficult move to play. The bishop's under attack. And so your first thought is let me defend that square rather than blockade on the file. So I'm with you. Knight d6 was a phenomenal shot. It ended up winning the game for Bragazzi. I did look for Morgan Stanley, Hungary, top board. That team is certainly one to look out for.
Okay. Thank you for the correction.
Oh, no, that wasn't meant as a correct. Just, we there's a lot to cover. We know there's so many different teams. And Bragazzi, he's played in the United States for quite a while, strong international master, and looking to lead the team to a world championship title. So you also found this game, Sam, this knight. I don't want to ruin the move. I almost ruined the move. I should not say what move it is. But the Abasov game against Zawadzka. So before I ruin the tactical sequence, I'll let you take this over because black played queen d6. And it looks like you're pretty close to keeping things together for now. But we also see that engine says almost +7. So what about this position, Sam? What was the crazy tactical sequence?
So here we have Grandmaster Abasov with the white pieces and his opponent, Zawadzka, I think is a women's international master. So we've got 2 title players going at it here, another strong first round pairing. And in this position, the crushing move is knight takes b7, which Abasov found. And you're just undermining the defense of the pawn on a6. So the key here is that even after the recapture on b7, yes, you are defending the a6 pawn. Still, you've got the king and you've got the queen, but white also has another shot in this position with rook takes c5. And the queen can no longer defend a6 and c5. And after queen takes c5, you have the beautiful, I think it's swallowtail mate, since it's on the kind of diagonals as opposed to an epaulet mate on the ranks and the files. So really beautiful mate right here with the black pieces, the rook and the pawn covering those escape squares. In the game, black did not take on c5. Of course, at this point, when you've gained your material back plus a pawn and you've broken the king's defenses for black, there's not really a lot of hope. The final position was really beautiful as white mobilized his rooks and then set up a battery with his bishop on e3. And in this position, black resigned. Rook takes c7, double check and mate is a threat. And there are probably like 30 more threats as well. And there's just nothing you can do, of course.
Yeah, one of those sad positions. So would be double check and checkmate. No defense left for black. So really nice tactical sequence there. And I actually pulled up one more game to look at here, and is the win by Maria Muzichuk, who is one of the two Muzichuk sisters, very strong players, grandmasters from Ukraine. And look at this final position. She was playing a FIDE master. This is a strong opponent of hers. But I mean, this checkmate on the board, black's pieces haven't left the first or second rank except those 3 pawns over there. Ooh, brutal finish. And I'm just going to go back a couple moves to show how this happened, because it started out even before here where things got out of hand quickly. Look at black's first move, Sam. G5.
Oh, that's concerning. I would want to be like, that's a mouse slip and they meant G6. Actually, given that they're a FIDE master and that they're playing a grandmaster, is that the most likely interpretation here? Like, I don't think that you go into a team tournament as a title player playing a higher rated title player and you do G5. If I was a teammate and that's not a mouse slip, I'm going to be a bit heated, to be entirely honest.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a tough pairing regardless. Maria Muzichuk, such a strong player, a grandmaster opponent, but G5 in a team event, because look at how quickly she takes advantage of strong center attacking this pawn. And the next move was G4. So it's not playing in fundamental principal style, and she very quickly took advantage. Notice as she could have taken this pawn, she didn't. She prioritized development, and she actually made the move pawn h3, just trying to say, I'm going to take back with my knight, my queen. If it took on g4, this pawn on d4 would have been captured. So let me just continue my normal development, and look, white is 3 minor pieces out. The rook is an attacking piece, and black's only developed 1 piece and has some long-term problems.
This is an amazing example of what not to do as black and what to do as white. So instructive. Wow. G5, G4. That is just all in. That is more insane than like Sardoche versus Myth. That's more insane than, Kevin Bordy playing the Grob against Magnus Carlsen. There's something to say for the Grob, maybe. Probably still the objective worst first move for the white player, but to play it with the black pieces, that's insane.
Yeah, just to finish this game off, I really like this move, bishop b5, because you do not want to trade queens as you're on the offensive, and you're also threatening to win a piece, because bishop takes c6 wins a piece. I'll show you why. Had black played a6, for example, bishop takes, the queen just lost its defender, so this queen is now threatened. You can't capture the bishop, and if you take the queen, then the bishop comes back and saves itself. So it took a knight and then takes the queen. White is up a piece.
That's very, very common in Puzzle Rush. People have seen this kind of capture and recapture tactic many, many times. And of course, in this case, there's actually choice, because you could also take with the knight and then fork on c7. I think that there's going to be a lot of choice for white in this game from this point forward.
Yes, and look at this, queen h5 check. In comes the bishop of c4. There's a checkmate on f7. So knight e5 played, and just simple move, bishop b3. The mating attack's going to happen. Look at these light squares that Maria took advantage of. Just trade it off. Now there's a bishop planted here. Black hasn't developed the king side. The king's on f8. And just to show how the game concluded, f4, g4. I'm not going to give you my pawn. Your queen's stuck. And no pieces can move for black. It's one of the saddest positions you can see. A knight c7 played, hitting the rook. And very importantly, the e6 square you take, you get forked. And queen h5. There's not really many moves. Queen g6 would be a way to block the checkmate. But unfortunately for black, your rook is left under attack, and that's that.
Fantastic play from Maria. I feel like she must have been enjoying her position just so much, around the point that she's playing G4, and you just control the light squares and everything in the position. And, tons of respect to the opponent for playing in this event, for heading up board 1 for their team against tough opponents. But G5, G4, I don't know about that in a team event. I think that whoever the team captain is needs to have a little bit of a conversation with the player about those particular moves.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, the last name involved means wolf. And, well, that was a howler. So, Sam, you and I, we're going to take a quick break. When we return, we will be ready for the second round of the FIDE Corporate World Chess Championship. And we are back. We are getting ready for some really exciting matchups. Sam, some of the teams probably going to get a little bit nervous. It's only round 2, but there's a lot to play for.
Already, the matches are really heated with Grandmaster versus Grandmaster matchups here. In Group C, we have Magnus Carlsen taking on Anton Korobov, a tremendous player. Two very, very strong players, obviously, with the world champion there. So we're going to be focusing a lot on that particular game, but there are many, many exciting games to follow in this particular round. Already in round 2, we've got so many rounds still to go.
And Korobov is, a 2,700 plus player. So that's a very tough matchup for Magnus Carlsen. And let's remind everybody of some of the standings here from the various pools, because we have different divisions. And as you can see in front of you, that the leaderboards here, we won't read out every single name, but that team from Morgan Stanley, Hungary in the Group C there, they're really strong. We saw Bergadzzi's win in the first round, and we see down the standings there also Optiver. That's going to be a good one. And Tata, we got to mention them because they host the tournament in Vaikonze, the Tata Steel Company. It's a great one. And how about from here, Sam? Of course, we have PayPal in Group D from Bulgaria, but what other teams stick out to you?
I think all the teams at the top are really impressive. I would also mention this Tata Consultancy Services in Chennai. You already mentioned Tata, but they're a very, very strong team. They have Pragna Ananta, and I believe that they were helping host the Tata Steel Chess India events. So they've been doing a lot for chess. And Kaspersky, right below there, they've been sponsoring the World Championship and a lot of FIDE events for a really, really long time. They make antivirus software, which is widely used, and a lot of other products that are really popular in Russia. So we've got a lot of really strong teams. I also like the State Bank of Mongolia. I want to mention them because they have one of Mongolia's best grandmasters on the top board there. And they really have some of the very best players in Mongolia. And I just like the fact that that team is closely tied together. Lots of players on the national team representing obviously one of the most important companies in Mongolia here. So those players, I think, probably know each other well and have a great team spirit.
For sure. And for our closest watchers who are longtime chess fans, there's things like the European Club Cup. So you may recognize some of these names like Alkaloid there in Group F. There are some familiar names, and they represent their companies well. And they also put together strong teams for these international competitions.
Absolutely. I'm also just drawn to the European Patent Office, The Hague. They must have very interesting and complex jobs, and I have a feeling that they're very organized. So we'll see how that carries through into their play.
Definitely. And so many different participants, so many different players from all around the globe. It's a truly international event. And, well, we're about to have liftoff. I see some games getting started here. They're going to creep in. So let's just pull up any old game here. I think that we have some from the team Optiver. You mentioned David Pardo Simon, and he's the white pieces against someone who's much lower rated than he is.
Right. He'll obviously be looking for a win here. Optiver is one of the stronger teams with Anish GIRI on board 1 and Pardo Simon, international master here. But they're going to have a challenging time moving on to the final on Sunday, of course. The format here is that there are 6 rounds. We've had 1 round. We're in round 2 right now. It is just getting underway. There are 4 more rounds to go, 1 more today, 3 more tomorrow. And then the top team in each of the 8 pools goes to a bracket, a knockout in the finals. That means that you have to be like the first of 93 teams in your pool. That's very, very difficult. It doesn't matter how strong your team is. You have to deliver in a very, very impressive way to be able to move on to the finals on Sunday. You don't get any missteps. If you do, another team is taking that place that you really hope for in the finals.
That's true indeed. And for a team like Optiver, I think their team rating is misleading in the other direction. We don't know from their board 4 just how strong she is. Their top 3 boards are well known, and Anish GIRI, of course, being the most famous of the bunch. But if she can perform better than her rating, which has not been stabilized, doesn't seem like she plays many tournaments, they could actually really win this thing. And we have Magnus Carlsen's game, so I am not going to waste any more time. He is playing Anton Korobov. We see the rating in the parentheses there, 27-37 for Anton Korobov. Magnus Carlsen at 28-27, and we have D4, D5. So Sam, what are you expecting from this one?
I am just expecting a great match. You know who Korobov reminds me of is Vasily Ivanchuk, a countryman, another player who's just over the past 3 decades been one of the best players in the world. Also been a very, very difficult matchup for Magnus Carlsen. I think both Ivanchuk and Korobov have kind of a sharp, but also positional style that's very unique, very flexible. And I think that they've both been kind of difficult matchups for Carlsen. And they've also been, to be honest, a little bit streaky. On a good day, I really think Korobov is one of those players who can beat absolutely anybody in the world, including Magnus Carlsen. And I think Carlsen, kind of knows that and respects that about Korobov. When he comes to play, he's just very, very difficult. And I think he also played one of the Magnus Tour events and really performed very well there and was close to leading at some point over the summer. There have been so many events in the tour at this point that it's hard to remember all the details, but it'll be really exciting to watch this whole game as it unfolds.
Absolutely. And Korobov has taken part in the Grand Chess Tour, which is a series of events comprised of the best players in the world. And he was a wild card. I remember he beat Vishy Anand in head-to-head in their game. He was one of the top finishers. So he is well established in the upper echelons of chess. Right now, he has put his queen on c2, bishop on d3, lining up towards the black king, but black is very solid. And we see a change in pawn structure. Typically, that means black is either playing for pawn b5, thanks to this pawn c6, but that pawn can become a weakness if you play b5, or e5 in the center. So this is, I would say, a solid approach thus far from Magnus, and we'll see how he continues right now.
Mm-hmm. And while this kind of game is getting underway, we're still early in the opening phase and not yet at the critical moment. We can mention that Magnus is playing for Kindred Group. They, of course, have many kind of brands incorporated into Kindred Group, and that includes Unibet. So they've been doing sports betting for a really long time. They've been connected with Magnus Carlsen. And I think that Magnus Carlsen is a player who really believes in, this kind of stuff, fantasy, sports betting, as a way to help drive some money into the game, to help drive interest into the game. And so this is a company that I really think that he's kind of aligned with in terms of their goals for how to grow chess, beyond just being sponsored by them. I really think this is a strong company that he feels connected to.
Well, if you made me into a betting man, I would not bet against Magnus Carlsen in chess matches. And he has been the top fantasy football, that is soccer to Americans, player in the world. He was the #1 ranked player. So he has a keen interest in sports betting and fantasy in particular. So it's not just about the betting, it's that competitive angle. He's talked about this in interviews where, hey, he was striving to be the best fantasy player on the planet, and he did achieve that. So he's just world champion in chess in all disciplines, and then he also dabbles and successfully so in fantasy football. So right now, Rook D1 was played. You see this weird pawn structure for black, right? A6, B7, C6, E6, F7. That bishop on C8 doesn't feel so good, but part of the reason A6 is played for black is that when you play B5, you can follow it up with C5, and your pawn on A6 defends that pawn that goes to B5. So A6 may seem like a bit slow to many people. Like, what's the idea? It looks like you're aiming for some kind of B5 or C5, but taking away the B5 square from white.
Absolutely. And of course, I think that many amateur players might look at this position and just assume that white is better because white is kind of expanded up through the 4th rank and black is still only on black's 3rd rank and further back. But black's position is very, very flexible. Black is ready to expand at some point. It's very hard to contain those B5, C5, and E5 breaks in a way that guarantees white an advantage. And of course, in round 1, we saw Magnus playing the King's Gambit against his opponent, who he outrated enormously. But here against Korobov, he's playing some mainline repertoire and really trying to, bring his theory to bear. That said, this is a 10-2 game. And he's down to 6 minutes and 44 seconds. So we would maybe think that he's in his prep, and that doesn't necessarily appear to be the case. He is thinking at this point, and the computer's indicating that this position is fine. Probably this position's been played a number of times, but he's trying to figure out how he gets that equality that he's looking for as black. What's the right way to play? And having used almost 4 of your 10 minutes up to this point is a bit of an eyebrow raiser.
It is indeed, and it changes the trajectory of the game. When you push a pawn, it cannot move backwards. So if Magnus intends to challenge the d4 pawn, and he plays b5 first, but he could play e5, in which case you do not have the same pawns. But if you play for c5, and then we get some kind of capture, then we have pawns on the same files. So he's trying to figure out the way to go. He plays b5, an aggressive approach, hitting the bishop, and now Korobov has a choice to make. Do you stay on the diagonal of a2 to g8, or do you go elsewhere? Does bishop d3 the move? Because that looks threatening on the king side, but then I'm in the rook's way. So these little moves, they really add up, and he chose bishop a2, and look at that, Sam. You see the engine bar there. It's starting to go a bit down in black's favor. Bishop a2 looks like a good move. I mean, what did you do wrong? You moved your bishop to safety, but that may have been an imprecise choice, and thus Magnus might have a way to start taking over the board and seizing the initiative.
Absolutely. And I know one thing that you absolutely hate, Robert, is the eval bar. It can be a shortcut that really prevents a lot of instructive thinking when you're spectating a game. The other thing to think about is that early in the game, in an opening position like this, where Korobov and Carlsen have so much experience, is often that the eval bar is wrong. Now, it's probably correct in indicating that bishop a2 might not have been the best move, but a lot of the people watching may also see Carlsen playing b5 and see that at that point, the eval bar went from about equal to an advantage for Korobov. And, you know, without taking a much deeper look than we're going to be able to take while spectating this 10-2 game, we can't really know exactly what's going on. But when you're dealing with these small advantages in the opening, oftentimes Carlsen, Korobov, these top players are actually more precise than the eval bar when you're looking at small differences in the opening phase.
That's right. And also, these tiny advantages come and go in the blink of an eye. And c5, that's a principal move, taking on c5. Now Magnus is a choice. How do you take back? He chooses the bishop. I think for some, the knight capture would seem more natural because, well, I'm getting my knight more advanced. I'm opening my bishop. But you see, the eval bar then goes in white's favor. So these decisions are very tricky. And I like bishop takes c5 because b4 still is an option. You can drop your bishop back. Instead of staying on the d file, which can be prone to attack, you can move like white did on the a7 g1 diagonal.
I've always really kind of enjoyed these positions for black. It's a bit over optimistic, but once I saw the game Rotlevi versus Rubinstein 1907, as a young player, I just always been attracted to positions where you might be able to get the bishops on these diagonals. There's a lot of tactics that can arise, you know, with bishop b7, bishop b6. Korobov is probably too strong to allow anything like that to happen, but there's still just a lot of pressure to deal with, and it's easy to allow Magnus to get an edge and to really start pressing this position. And maybe another thing to mention as the players are thinking here is that Magnus really, really needs a win. Now, Korobov is a player against whom Magnus would normally be happy to get a draw against with the black pieces, of course. Magnus is always looking to win against every player he faces, but Korobov is 27-37. You know, he's definitely a player that Magnus respects. But playing board one here for Kindred, that is going to, it's a position where Magnus needs to win. If Kindred is going to have a hope to get into the finals, Magnus is going to need to go 6-0. That's just the truth of it. So he's really got to try to get the full point in this position. It's an unrated team event, and Magnus needs 6 out of 6 if his team is going to make it through.
And that's a lot of pressure to put on even the world champion, winning games just on demand with the black pieces against super grandmasters. Not that easy. And knight e4 played by Korobov. And look at Magnus go bishop b7. Quick response. Giving up the bishop by saying, you know, at this high level, we tend to talk about the bishop pair being the all-important thing. hey, my rook's quickly coming to c8. My bishop on b7 is better than your bishop on a2. And that's these small differences in position that we need to assess. That this bishop on a2 staring into a kind of brick wall of a pawn structure because the pawn e6 is defended by another pawn, whereas the bishop on b7 is superior as it aims on the board's longest diagonal and a pawn is not blocking its path.
Absolutely. And this is a position where the engine is indicating that white might be a little bit better or it's equal, but it definitely feels to me like a position where I'd be a bit concerned with the white pieces. You know, that I've got that bishop on c1, it's not looking so hot. Rook on a1, that bishop on a2, I'm not so sure about. It's kind of biting on granite. And black has really good control over e4 and seems to have a bit more of a fluid development. And it feels, from a human perspective, I think like it's at least a little bit more easy to play for Magnus.
I think most would agree, and black is fully developed at that. You all your minor pieces out, you can put a rook on c8, a rook on d8. The question becomes, what pieces do you want to see traded? The bishops will show off their might as this one on c1 gets out to d2 and maybe to c3 or even b4, depending on what happens in the position. And look at Magnus go. Wait, sorry, what was that about bishop getting out to d2 and elsewhere? No, I'm going to bring my knight in and I can just take your bishop off. But I don't think that white's in any danger unless you do something kind of hectic. I think white's position is solid, and Korobov can play for more. Perhaps he should play for more with moving the knight, trying to replace the knight with a pawn on f3. If you can get a pawn on f3 and e4, and I'll just make a random move just to sort of show that, if you can get pawns on f3 and e4, that bishop on b7 suddenly doesn't look so good because the pawn chain is strong for white, and this bishop on c1 now has a whole diagonal to work with.
Absolutely. Very sophisticated kind of setup here for white, but this is just a very, very effective way to play, and it looks like Korobov is going for it. Without that dark squared bishop for Magnus, f3 and e4 is a structure where it's very hard for him to kind of take advantage of the soft spots, which are the dark squares. So he's pushing forward with e5. If we were going to see something aggressive in this game for either player, what do you think it would be? How would a player really try to imbalance things and push for a win?
It's a great question. And I'll say, for starters, the bishop on a2 is, I was going to say maybe reroute that, but now it's turned into a green piece. It's a happy piece as the pawn e6 out of the way, but the knight gets to f5. I just like the coordination of black's pieces. If you ever try to play b4, watch out for that c3 square. And maybe Magnus can quickly go for an attack because his bishop on b7 is strong and he plays his queen to g5.
Queen g5.
Pretty clear that if you didn't do anything about it, there is a problem down on g2. So if you move your knight, there's nowhere else to go but knight d6, and I can just even take your knight because there's a mate on g2. Also, a move like knight c3 is not out of the question, threatening the checkmate and threatening your queen and your rook all at once. That's just a devastating.
I like that you had a free knight and you still found an even better move. Well done.
Yeah, this looked pretty good to me. So don't take the knight, go for the checkmate and the queen under attack. So knight g3 played, of course, to block the queen's threat on the g2 square. And Sam, I think we can both speak from experience that when you get a position that looks good and you're aggressive as black, but then you suddenly get pushed back a little bit and the bishops can shine. So do you get the feeling, maybe just me right now, that Korobov is going to get out of this, and if he gets this like f3, e4 at some point, then the bishop on c1's happy, or am I looking too much in that bishop advantage for white?
You're being more sophisticated than me. You're describing something that I've experienced many times. I would go for Magnus's position in a heartbeat. I really like long diagonal pressure, this pretty knight on e4. And I've played many kinds of attacks like this with the black pieces, and I have been pushed back. And I have ultimately lost games in a lot of cases where I was like, where did I go wrong? Mm-hmm. So I'm liking black, but I can absolutely relate to everything you're saying. This is a position where maybe eventually the bishop pair is going to really be very, very potent. And black's real asset here is some activity, which is, of course, legitimate, and some pressure maybe on that long diagonal. But those are kind of short-term gains. Now, it looks like we're going to get a liquidation, and maybe this is going to be the second game along with Nihal Sarin versus Anish Giri, where we actually see one of the top seeds held back, and they might not be able to really get winning chances. The position is simplifying. The pawn structure is symmetrical. how is either player really going to push for a win if more pieces get traded on the D file?
That's a great question. And I mean, one of the things is bishop on a2 is staring at this f7 pawn. So we keep talking about this bishop on b7, but the bishop on a2 is actually a sneakily good piece as well. It looks like it should be relatively level. I see that the engine says completely equal, but that's so misleading. There's so much life left. And Magnus only has a minute and 30 seconds on his clock, and he needs to win for his team. So I think that here he plays knight e4, and you see White's advantage creeping up a little bit. It's starting to like White's position, and then going back down. And you said this, the depth issue of the engine means that it's not seeing too far along. And in fact, players can outcalculate the engine when it's on lower depth levels.
Absolutely. And when there's, in this case, two open files, but often you're kind of dealing with, one open file. And in this case, the open file that seems to matter at the moment is the D file. And the players are challenging each other on that open file. A lot of times that leads very, very quickly to exchanges. And I think this is true in this case. It's hard to avoid some more exchanges. And we just saw another pair of rooks leave the board. It's very, very possible that the final pair of rooks might leave the board as well. Seems like rook d1 is a very, very natural move for Korobov to play here. And, as pieces leave the board, how is either player really going to press? Of course, for his team, I think Korobov holding Magnus Carlsen to a draw here, even with the white pieces, maybe holding isn't the right word because he's such a great player. That could put his team in a great spot to get the match victory against Kindred, Carlsen's team.
It's very difficult to balance the, hey, I might have a slightly better position now from the white side, and I'm playing Magnus Carlsen. I would love to beat him. But then you take a step back. Wait, I'm playing on a team here. So the most important thing is that the team wins. A win over Magnus Carlsen, that's a lifetime achievement. But right now, it's not about that, because if I play to win, maybe I lose the game because I'm not thinking objectively. And I think that Korobov, he will be objective. He's ahead on the clock. He's just trying to figure out the right way to push forward. And you don't want to say, let me just make a draw, because then you're still thinking about results. You need to play the position. And rook d1 does feel like a good start.
Absolutely. And I don't think that Korobov has been playing for a draw here. I think he's just been playing his chess. And the opening selected in this game is rook c1. So he is optimistic, not playing for a draw. I would have thought that rook d1 was kind of the playing for a draw move in this case. But he's keeping pieces on the board, and he's got ideas of bishop takes f7, as you point out, and rook c7 or just rook c7. And that's intense. So he's still bringing pressure, and he does have, more than double Carlsen's time on the clock. I really would feel like a draw would be a great result for Korobov from a team standpoint, because I think that his team is outrating Kindred on the other boards, but it looks like he's going for more than that.
And right now, Magnus under a minute. Korobov doing very well on the clock, 2 minutes, 41 seconds. Queen e7, that's a very smart move by Magnus, bringing the queen back to defend. But now Magnus is on the defensive, so he needs to figure out, wait, my team needs me to win. I don't see anything that I can do. That bishop on b7, it looks good. It's aesthetically pleasing, but is it doing all that much? How are you going to team up on this g2 pawn? That's
the f7 pawn definitely feels weaker than the g2 pawn at this point. Maybe queen c2 and queen into c7. Queen c2 cannot be met by rook c8 because you will trade down. Actually, no, you can't do that.
Right, you're right.
I miscounted for a moment. And after queen f8, white will have an extra bishop in the final position.
Exactly, a very forcing sequence. And it looks like a couple moves have been played. b4 and g6 with choices. b4 on one hand gives you the c5 square as a nice place to put your rook. On the other hand, it makes a3 a little looser. So if black can somehow get into the third rank or go after this a3 pawn, it can become a target.
And I think that what g6 is making left. It makes a lot of sense, of course. I think g6 is also intending king g7 at some point, very, very likely. And then maybe something like pawn to f6. I don't know if you want to play that and soften the 7th rank. You might need to be very careful about that. But you can potentially shift some of the pawns forward over time, taking pressure off of the pawn on f7 and the king on g8. That's definitely where Korobov has been putting some pressure, although it's looking more and more like things are going to liquidate from here. We've been saying liquidation is likely, and we got some interesting moments.
I don't know if Magnus can, and that's the problem. He does queen d3, but even queen a2 is potentially possible, going for the f7 pawn. And Magnus 23 seconds. he does not have that much time to figure this out.
That's a fascinating move. I was definitely expecting queens to likely leave the board after the queen came down on the d file, but of course you were right, and they don't have to leave the board. Korobov can keep them on, and
But
I think that. What
so
were you saying?
I was just gonna say, Sam, that could be a losing move as well, because queen a2 may hit f7, but you can potentially give up f7 with queen e4, and you see the eval bar. I was looking at this, right? Bishop f7 check, the king moves away, and this is a problem. The rook gets to de1, and this king is actually very weak for white, so that's why this move would not be good to keep the queens on the board. And he takes on f7 first. That way, when he trades queens, he'll have rook c7 check, fancy tactic that liquidates.
And after the capture on b7, there's also going to be a capture here on a3 as well, right? Yes, because the queens have to get traded. And so that's why the computer is calling this equal and white hasn't won a pawn. All of that happens in the blink of an eye. Is there still any edge for either player here? I mean, I guess I would the king is coming up the board. You have to be a little careful about the king invading. So I guess this is going to lead to a trade. That's why rook a4 here, to make sure that you don't wait too long, and king h3, h4, g5 might happen. The rook capturing on b4 will prevent the king's invasion if you can arrange it in the right way. Still looks a little tricky, potentially.
Yeah.
It feels like white is the one who can definitely create some chances, although this is not those chances.
I think we've seen better pawn structures before, and double isolated pawns, 2 sets of them for white. Magnus may have 16 seconds left, but he has more than enough time to hold his rook e4 and just go after the e-pawns. Both of them will fall.
With such a fractured structure here, and the white king not having gotten active, of course.
Wait,
it's
sorry, go ahead.
Ooh, it's
I was just going to say,
be worried about rook b1.
Yeah, me too. I'm like, this pawn is actually a stronger pass pawn.
Yeah, the idea potentially after g4 of like rook b1 burying the king on h2, and then suddenly the b pawn racing down the board was definitely scary for a moment. You can never let your guard down against
rook b1,
either
rook b1, no,
rook b1, rook b1,
and it's
whoa,
and you're gonna lose these pawns. Magnus suddenly is turning this around, and Korobov can't move.
Why did the king go back that way? That's insane.
Oh my gosh. And the king can't move, so he has to move the rook at some point. And then this king, there could be a stalemate trick, though. You have to be careful and precise if you're Magnus, because I want to give away both of my pawns, and I'll check your king forever.
And that could be so exciting, a potential like sacrifice of the rook to achieve stalemate.
Okay, where's the win? The rook is trying to come back to b5. You can move your rook to c1 and up to c3 to defend the pawn this way. He does do that, but it looks like the eval bar dropped, so it doesn't love this decision. Although it feels like white's still a little bit stuck because the g3 pawn falls.
And now the king comes back. We're going to have to look at this afterwards and figure out what the engine was loving about the position. And of course, it's not over, but the engine is saying that the chances seem to have gone away at this point.
Right. Rook takes g3, king back, and the king is freed up. So that king was caught on h2, couldn't move. There still is something to play for Magnus. You know him. He does not just agree on a draw. Even if it looks that it should be, g3 check can be thrown in at some point. He checks and puts a pawn on b2. And Korobov has 15 seconds. And is his king in time to get this pawn? It looks like it is. So after you take on g2, the king will run right this way, and the pawn will be grabbed.
Right. And it seems to matter, I think, also that the white rook is doing a good job of making it hard for the black king to approach as well.
Yes. And I wonder if the engine evaluation was accurate, or if there were stalemate tactics that it overlooked. But by the way, rook c8 check could have won the rook, but then this pawn would have promoted. So don't just go win a rook when the pawn is on the 7th rank, or in this case, the 2nd rank. So it looks like you're going to sacrifice your rook for the b pawn. White is going to end up pushing the g pawn, and black will have to sacrifice. Watch out for rook b4, though. Be careful. Oh, gosh. Magnus
we see from Magnus, kind of a little bit of a head bob there, saying, all right, it's a draw, seems clear that Magnus is, aware that the rook is about to sacrifice on b2. Of course he is, because he's the greatest player in the world, maybe in world history. And, he's just kind of tuning out a little bit, saying, all right, there's nothing more. I've got that one trick with the rook coming to f4 and b4, and Korobov just gives up the rook and makes sure that that doesn't happen.
Yes, and the game is drawn, so they split the point, and that's a win for, I would say, for Sparebank in that one because Kindred needs Magnus to win their games based on the ratings of the other boards. Let's keep on going. Plenty of good games left. I'm going to click on this one. I see time trouble between Kowalewski with the black piece. It's a FIDE master, and FIDE master Kadatsky with white. And look at this position, Sam, where it's extra material for white in terms of, oh, wait, sorry. It's not extra material for black. I didn't even calculate all things.
No, black has an extra knight.
Yeah. Like, I'm like looking, I was like, wait a second. I calculated this king as like a rook, and I was like, whoa. But even though it's an extra knight, the evals is equal now, and it's because of all these passed pawns. And then it dropped immediately. Like, what is this?
I would have immediately played e6. So the engine is, parsing this so quickly, but of course on a human level, this is incredible. What was better than e6?
Right? E6 somehow, and h3, which looks like a good move, somehow a bad move.
I don't understand anything here.
A wildly
rook b2.
Okay, watch out. That's a discovered check. Where's the king going? And if you move the king, there's king d7 hitting the rook.
Mm-hmm.
Wait a sec.
I was exclusively focusing on these pass pawn tactics, but this rook d2 or rook b2 idea is just so nice.
Yeah, and the king
a draw by perpetual.
I guess because the king has the c6 square to run away to. Wow, knight g8, what a brave move to play in time trouble. Okay, so if the bishop moves, you drop the c7 pawn. He brings the king right back, protecting the pawn, and we might get a repetition here. This is
what a weird repetition. Wow. Okay. So at least at the end, perfect play as the computer agrees with the draw by repetition there. Just like with Magnus's game, we've got to look at that again afterwards with the computer because it's really hard to figure out, what was going on after some of these moves.
Definitely. And Georg Meyer is playing for Grenke. Let's go over to his game. It looks like, what's the material count? Because I just miscalculated material. It looks like white is up a minor piece for 2 pawns. So that's why the engine loves Georg's position. He is extra material, 3 points for 2, and he is coordinated very well. So the queen is being pushed back, and he then can go after these queenside pawns. He can start attacking them.
Very, very beautiful coordination here from Georg. He's always just had an incredible style for coordination. I think that's one of the things that when you look at Georg's games kind of immediately stands out in a beautiful way is just that his pieces are always working together really, really well. And of course, Georg is one of those players who can beat anybody in the world, including Vladimir Kramnik, who he has defeated in a really incredible and famous game, and potentially Magnus Carlsen, should they manage to face off. And of course, Georg is also board 1 for Grenke, the Grenke Bank, who hosts the Grenke tournament, which is an incredible tournament. And they are one of the top seeds in this event. So they have a very, very good shot of making it to the final. And Georg's looking like he's doing everything right by his team at this point.
Yes, and their 4th board in Agrest is like nearly 2,300 FIDE. So their team is quite balanced. Some teams have a very highly rated first board and their 4th board, maybe a newer player. In this case, every single board's experienced and can compete with all the top players in the world. So I just want to go back a quick moment here because I see where the piece was given up. I mean, black's position at this point looked fine just a couple moves ago. And after bishop h6, the knight came to d2. And after queen a5, black was trying to go and pin this piece and win it. But after b4, instead of just saying, all right, maybe queen a5 wasn't the right choice, I should move my queen back, there was a knight sacrifice on b4, likely thinking that this knight couldn't be defended so easily. But a move like e3 also comes to mind. But bishop c3 is the most precise, kicking the queen back while defending the knight. And this was not a correct piece sacrifice from black.
Right. Very, very optimistic. It's tough when you're playing a grandmaster, a player who's outrating you by quite a lot, but you sometimes just have to be patient. Say, all right, I'm going back, and I'm going to hope that my grandmaster opponent makes a mistake later in the game. I think that being patient is one of the most difficult things against a higher rated opponent because frankly, time is on their side. Like you are more likely to make mistakes as the game continues, but you can't let that push you into making decisions that aren't justified, like knight takes b4.
That's right. And we can come back here, but I'm going to pull up the game of Yakovenko, another super grandmaster who is playing in this one. You see the rating in parentheses 2911, but playing an international master. I think that 2030 rating, that's just the online rating for the player's account. That's a
Yeah.
teeny bit misleading, wouldn't you say?
That is a teeny bit misleading. I actually know Piotr, and he heads up InfoShock, which is one of the most popular kind of chess content outlets in Poland. It's a fantastic organization. They do tournaments, they do blogs, all kinds of great stuff. Definitely check it out if you are looking for Polish content. And of course, his rating of 2030 is totally inaccurate. He's a very strong IM. And he's playing a good game so far against Yakovenko. And he's got a really unique position here. Like the pawn's hanging back on e2. It hasn't advanced yet. And he's got, a kind of nice control over the light squares. It's a hyper modern setup, but a very, very playable one for white.
And as you're pointing out, the pawns feel safe and sound for white, but black has better space because of this pawn on c5 and e5 taking control of the center. But with the pawns on b2 protecting c3, e2 protecting d3, it's hard to see how black makes progress. And I just looked up Piotr's rating, 2411. So I hope that Yakovenko didn't just look at the Chess.com rating here and say, oh, okay, I'm playing somebody who's 2000. You should always play the board regardless, but this is where you can be misled by the rating next to the name. And okay, bishop b5, queen d6. At some point, Sam, I believe a5 is what white wants to play for. And well, right now, to try to open up the a file and make this rook useful.
And it's very, very interesting. Many, many things can happen from here. The game is kind of in full tension mode. Who knows how the game is going to develop from this point on? And of course, what you're saying about just not kind of taking your opponent's rating at face value is incredibly important in this tournament. I think everyone should just assume that they're playing some 2400 blitz player who's never played a FIDE rated game in their life, because it's going to be true for some of the players in this particular event. And you don't want to be the more experienced player who makes some decisions that you would not make if you realize what your opponent's kind of true skill was. I think there are definitely some players who have a rating of like 1000 who actually are very experienced online players and are much, much stronger than that.
Yes, and it's easy to just be lulled into a false sense of security. And I think that Yakovenko, he sees the title, and he probably has known this player, Piotr Wen, and I mean, just very strong. And right now with the queen on h4, it's such a strange position, Sam, because white's playing on both sides. Like you're looking, wait, is bishop h6 happening, or is pawn takes b6 happening? And the answer might be both. And Yakovenko plays a great move, f5, which plays on both sides of the board as well. It looks like it's only playing on the king side, but you also are opening up your rook to the defense of the h7 square if for some reason your king got in some trouble, and the rook can slide to the king side as well. I think that black is trying to push through with a move like f4.
Right. Yakovenko is meeting this kind of hyper modern setup from Piotr with just direct central aggression, which is very classical. It's absolutely what I think we would advise most of the amateur players in the chat to do. And it certainly looks challenging to meet. Even if the computer is saying that this position is equal, and of course the computer is usually right, it definitely feels easier to make a game-losing error at this point for white, to allow an f4 or an e4 or something to crash through in a decisive way. That said, it's really hard to see how that would work right away. And maybe if black overextends, white can also get the chances in the game.
Well, I also am looking at this move rook f1. I think you're trying to meet f4, but white's combination of moves probably not as precise as possible, because these rooks at some point can slide back to the a file. That's the board's only fully open file, and a rook can then go down to the square like a2 and cause problems for white on the queen side. This is why we tell everybody, look at the entire board. The action may look like it's taking place on the king side, but if you're not careful, all of a sudden queenside infiltration happens, and that can be a problem. Another idea I would have to mention is bishop retreat and queen up to d5. But if this bishop leaves d5, then white's bishop will go to c4 with a pin on the diagonal. So you want to line up the checkmate, just not possible yet.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that you're pointing out is that space gives Yakovenko so many more maneuvering options. access potentially to the A file. His rooks can swing all over the 8th and 7th ranks to attack different sensitive points in the white position. He has the ideas of pushing these pawns like he's just done with f4. He has bishop b7 and queen d5. So many more options. That said, none of them are clearly decisive. And there was a clip recently of Daniel Naroditsky talking about the spatial advantage and saying that a spatial advantage is, not really an actual advantage. It's something that you kind of have to turn into a more tangible advantage. And so far, Yakovenko hasn't managed to do that. He's got to find some way to convert this theoretical spatial advantage into something concrete, picking up material or actually making a direct attack, finding some weak points that he's able to target, creating a structural issue. So far, still very, very difficult to figure out the path forward. Now, e4 is a very, very committal move. What should happen now?
Yeah, no,
should you just pull the bishop back? Bishop e6?
I really like that decision, because had you taken en passant, which was possible, then the queen can just take back on e3, and then the e5 pawn feels like the biggest target. That's an isolated pawn that I'm staring at. And in general, in this position, the bishop on b5 is doing a ton. It is holding down the d3 pawn, which looks like a pawn that black wants to pile up on. And so for the time being, that pawn is safe. But you talk about how spatial advantages, you need to prove something. I mean, this is already now clear. He induced e4, and now this d3 pawn is a long-term target. The king on g2 feels much less safe than the king on g8. Look at all these pieces around the black king, and this pawn on f4 is a threatening piece. And this bishop on b5, while it defends d3, it doesn't help on the king side. So if at some point a move like bishop g4 can be played, the bishop on b5 rather can't help get back. But instead, I think Yakovenko rushed this, and it looks like we have an even trade-off here.
And the computer immediately demonstrated a lot of skepticism about the capture on g3, as you're saying. One other thing about the bishop on b5 is that it almost feels kind of out of play. Like it seems like it's a well-placed piece kind of up on the b5 square. Like if it's the knight, we would talk about it being placed, in an outpost or something like that. But in this position, what is that bishop really doing? Black's bishop is kind of restraining it. You can't pull that bishop back to c4 because you don't want to accept that pawn structure weakness if there's a trade of bishops on c4. So that bishop feels a little bit stuck. It's hard for white to figure out what to do exactly with that bishop. That said, after like queen e3 here, how is Yakovenko making any progress in the position?
I think as soon as that queen moves, he'll play h5, because something important to note is we have even material, right? We have a queen, a bishop, and 5 pawns per side. But black actually has an extra pawn if you look at it from where the pawns are. So black has an extra pawn from the G and H files all the way in the flank. White has an extra pawn in the center. But your central extra pawn cannot push thanks to all 3 of these pieces. You are not pushing that pawn to d4, whereas black can play h5, black can play g5, maybe play h4, and that can create a passed pawn that white will be tied down to.
All right. So question here, and actually white's last move makes this question more relevant. Who wants the queens on the board? Who wants the queens off the board?
It depends on how they're traded. You'll note that Yakovenko said, you can take me, but look at my king coming up, and I get to keep my outside pass pawn potential here. So I think the queen trade, it favors black in terms of creating the pass pawn. But for white, probably said, all right, there's nothing better to do, and I don't think of this pass pawn situation winning. I personally really like black's chances here. This pawn is coming here. The bishop's coming to e6, and then h4 at some point.
And so here, probably bishop e6, right? And the king and pawn endgame might very well be losing just by force for white. In fact, king and pawn endgames are usually by force. Whether it's winning, drawing, or losing, it's by force. If you calculate deep enough in a king and pawn endgame, you can achieve some measure of truth. I want to say that, I don't remember which famous author said this, but one famous author said that the only evaluations for king and pawn endgames are winning, drawing, or losing if you look deep enough, or transposition to a queen endgame. And you can't really talk about slight advantage or clear advantage necessarily in a king and pawn endgame because they're so forcing by nature.
And we see a forcing decision here, but the engine didn't love that. Maybe it was waiting for a more timely decision to push that pawn, but in a bullet scramble. Right now, white has 43 seconds of counting down. You're looking, can I get away with pawn to d4, or does that actually help black because this pass pawn is really far up the board? And outside pass pawns are so valuable in the endgame because say the bishops get traded, this king will have to go all the way to the h file, and black's king will then start playing in the center of the board where all the remaining pawns are. So this pawn is a decoy more than anything. And Piotr down to 20 seconds. How is he going to handle this?
That allows king g5 with a tempo, and then bishop h5, right?
And then just try to trade off those bishops, it looks like. Yeah, that looks pretty good to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm guessing Piotr was relying on d4 as an idea, trying to create a pass pawn of his own, but it seems like it could be a bit slow.
Still very, very complicated. We see that the computer is saying, you know, like -1, -2 or something like that. That does not necessarily mean it's decisive. White or black is probably going to win the white bishop for the pawn. Well, maybe you just promote by force in some lines like king g3, king into f2. I'm thinking that if you manage to give up your bishop for the h pawn, probably you can draw. But
he's not
I'm
going to
not
allow
sure
it.
You're going to it.
And this is why bishop e6 was so good. Oh, and look at that. I said he wasn't going to allow it. And then it went down to zeros. And this is how tricky endgames are, by force. And here comes the pawn to h3. So leaving that sacrifice was a losing decision.
And the bishop is going to g4 to f3. And you're just going to eliminate that light square bishop.
And a big problem for white is the king can't get in. So even, I would need to be able to take your last pawn, because if black just goes in and promotes, then the king can come back and help out. And this king cannot enter for white. The king would have to go around to f6. It's a very long journey.
And unfortunately, also the white pawns can't really make progress. Black has managed to push the pawn all the way down to h2, and the pawn on e5 has just been sitting there, not able to get up somewhere like e7, where there'd actually be counterplay. And maybe in this case, you just queen. Okay, I was expecting the bishop maneuver, but now you can win without that.
Yeah, because the pawn's on a light square. If this pawn were back on b4, this would not be a good decision. Right. Yakovenko times this perfectly, takes on b5. The bishop can just go back, and then the bishop protects the b pawn. So even if this king were on b4, this setup with pawn b5 and bishop on e8, the pawn's on a light square defended, and don't lose your bishop. Now the king can't even catch the pawn. We'll get a promotion.
You're winning the bishop for the pass pawn if you want, but it doesn't matter, of course, because black is going to get a queen. I like the king f6, king g5, king f4 maneuver. Like he's trying like a ready in-game study kind of thing to move around with the king. Of course, there's not quite enough tempos to make it happen. The square of the pawn is too far advanced. The white king can't return. But I like the idea. I like that, we probably mostly know this famous ready in-game study where the king zigzags from h8 to e5 and then catches this h pawn you think it could never catch. And Piotr is trying to create out of thin air, kind of like that study does, some extra tempo, but it's not quite there in this particular position.
And one of the largest problems, and we saw the eval bar, it fluctuated for like one move. When you are watching and you have that evaluation bar, you see, oh wait, there's something that saves the day. Piotr probably was feeling pretty dejected at the point. And we'll look at it after we take a break, but just to show that a position once more, when you get to a position like this, where you know that black is in charge, maybe there is a way to hold when you have 16 seconds or whatever it was left. That's not going to do the trick, but you just start feeling bad. The trajectory of the game has been from one where you felt like you were holding off your super grandmaster opponent to one where you're like, oh, that's an outside pass pawn. I've studied enough chess, played enough chess to realize my position isn't good. And you could actually lose the game before you actually lose the game, because mentally you've kind of resigned in advance and you don't find all your best chances, especially in a time scramble situation.
And we see the eval bar. The chat sees the eval bar. That is such a huge influence for us mentally. We're like, there's probably still a way to draw. And mentally, Piotr, might be thinking that eval bar is at the bottom right now, and that the computer's just saying that it's a win and there's nothing to find. That's a mentality that is so difficult to challenge in the computer era. But you have to kind of constantly keep searching for the resources, even when it's very easy to kind of think that, maybe this is just lost at this particular point. I don't think that Piotr was probably quite there in this position, but as you say, it's difficult. You know your opponent is pressing. You're not sure if there's a way to find it. You have seconds on the clock. Piotr played a great game. This was really a fine effort against a top GM in Yakovenko.
Yeah, great showing. Unfortunately for him, didn't go his way. For Yandex, they're very happy that Yakovenko won. And the second round of this FIDE Online World Corporate Chess Championship, it is over with. We are going to take a break, and we just want to remind everybody before we do to use the command donate, please, if you're able to. This is raising money for a charity for various funds, so do get involved if you can. We would really appreciate it. But for now, we will take a break. When we return, Sam and I will go over all that's just happened in round 2, some exciting moments, and there will be round 3 ahead. And we return 2 rounds in the books from the opening groups from the East here. Sam, it's been fun thus far. Some top-heavy matchups, some upsets. I actually was talking to you during the break about a 500-point upset in one of the matches. That's pretty great to see.
Absolutely. It's fantastic. We've got to find a way to make it easy to find all these upsets and really showcase them, because there are so many players in this event who just don't get to play a lot of chess, but maybe they're playing a lot online. Maybe they're playing a lot in their lunch breaks and such. And to get to go in to a team tournament to represent their company with their friends and colleagues, and to get that upset is really an achievement. And it feels so good for these players when they're able to do that.
It certainly must. And well, this wasn't an upset. It was a draw on one of the top boards, but we were looking at Anton Korobov against Magnus CARLSEN, that game for a while. So we can analyze where Magnus let a great position slip up, because he was really close to actually winning this game, and it didn't look like he should. But one small slip here at this moment where white went king h2, that looks like a totally reasonable, fine choice. But the problem with putting the king on h2 is after rook came to b1, the king is cut off. And the way this can do with rook to b5, mistakes often come in pairs. You lose the e6 pawn, you take h5. And the winning way for Magnus would have been to slide his king over to c6 to try to take away the b5 square. Because the best way to defend against a passed pawn is by putting your rook behind the pawn. So if the king started with king to d6, well, note that this king on h2 can't move. So white would love to get rid of this pawn. If that pawn didn't exist, I will sacrifice my rook for a stalemate, but because the pawn is still here, I'm actually trying to avoid it. If you go rook to b5, I'll go king to c6. I'm trying to bring my king up and ignore your pawn for now before bringing my rook out after my king defends the pawn. It's a very rich endgame here, Sam. One you don't get to see very often.
Absolutely. I think that obviously Magnus is famous for his in-game play. He generates these kind of rich, complex, difficult decisions for his opponent in the in-game over and over again. We were really expecting a draw in this game much earlier. And then we got here and we saw king h2 and we were both going, hey, what about rook b1? The white king is trapped. And of course that did happen, but as you're showing, the path to precisely take advantage of that, especially given that white has very serious stalemate resources in this position, is just, a very, very narrow path. So generating this kind of winning position by Magnus is just, it's the stuff that makes him so amazing, so impressive, and the greatest in-game player in the world. It didn't quite in this case with 10, 20 seconds on the clock manifest as a win, because it was so hard to find the exact moves here, but Magnus created these winning chances and a real winning opportunity where I think almost no one would have really thought that he was going to be able to press for a win.
That's right. And I just want to show a stalemate, a funny one. If rook e5 check, something like that, the king takes, but it's black's turn. So that's like king d6, e5. Just to show what can happen is if you play e6 and you take, you'll notice that this king has no moves. These pawns have no moves. So rook e5 checks is take my rook. And I will just follow your king no matter where it goes. Put my rook right in front of you. And I'm going to go from a5 to h5. You can't do anything. Eventually, you will have to take the king, the rooks rather. You'll run out of moves, and that would be a stalemate. So the key here is even if this pawn were push up, you're not taking the pawn. That's how Magnus wins the game. Instead of taking the pawn, you move your king away from it, and that way this rook can't get to stop the pawn. Your king on c6 takes away any kind of b file. Your king still wants to run up, and after e6, you can bring your rook out to then go take the pawn. And once your rook takes the pawn, the king gets g1, but it's too late because black has his b3 pawn.
And black has the idea in just a moment of b2 and then like rook h1, and then you promote that way. Although you might not have to sacrifice the rook after b2. You're just able to move the rook out of the way and then promote.
I was just showing that's a nice thing to show everybody that sometimes you give up the rook to be a forcing move, so white doesn't have time to promote, and then you get a queen with check and then take care of the pawn. So a nice, fun end game. It wasn't ultimately a win, but there were chances out of thin air. And speaking of chances, this one here that we were looking at between Piotr Nguyen and Dmitry Yakovenko, it looked like black was just dominating, right? This position, the white king is stuck, c5 covered, d5 covered, opposition, the king on f4, very active, and if the king releases, the e5 pawn falls. But king f3 was actually a mistake. And we saw this during the game, that the evaluation bar plummeted, if you're thinking about this from Yakovenko's perspective. And the reason why is so difficult to see. It's actually the move bishop c4. You don't think in this manner of like, I'm going to go promote my pawn. You're thinking, I'm going to sacrifice my bishop for your pawn. But in fact, your pawn is ready to promote in the event of a bishop trade, and the queens will happen at the same time.
That's super instructive. As you say, it's so hard to get into that mentality of let's enter a pawn race. Like it feels like the opponent's pawn is so far advanced. It feels like you would just lose the pawn race. So there's kind of a mental block against this idea of bishop c4. You figure you're just losing that, and you need to find some way to give up the bishop for the h pawn and then try to draw the end game by eliminating black's last pawn. That didn't turn out to be possible. So that's just a fantastic and instructive resource.
Right, because typically you give up the bishop for this h pawn, your king gets to b5, you take that last pawn, and that's how you make a draw, but the king can't get in. So great kind of construction here by Yakovenko. Say a fortress, but usually a fortress means like holding a draw. No, he just keeps the king out. And so the king can't get in, and bishop c4 would have been that last try. And as we were talking about, black will go and promote, but white promotes as well. And funnily enough, the side that promotes first might be the side that's in more trouble, because that pawn on b6, very close to the white king. This could, in fact, have been a total turn in white's favor.
Absolutely. Very, very difficult, even if the eval bar is saying that this is equal to draw, especially with very, very little time on the clock. Keep in mind, these are rapid games. This is 10-2. And so as great as these players are, there's going to be mistakes, and you need to think a lot about the practical chances and the challenge of getting these draws, even when the computer is saying, oh, it's easy, it's 0.00.
No, easy is the last thing I think about when I see this position, where you make one mistake and the queens get traded, for example. This king for white is so close to that remaining pawn, it could be a losing king and pawn in game. So we went through these two, and there is another one that you had pointed out. It was this game between Anisimov, Pavel Anisimov. He's a popular streamer and plays a lot of chess on Chess.com, Title Tuesdays. He's well known, and he had the black pieces here. So Sam, why don't you take us through this? Because I think even the first move from this position, where white has the advantage, might be a surprise to many.
Well, I think you were focusing on this particular middle game position. So I actually hadn't seen how black developed their attack here. I was focused a little more on the end game, but I think you were mentioning that black actually generated some chances here by pushing the H pawn here a little bit Alpha Zero style. Bent Larsen famously said that when you're unsure what to do, you should push a rook pawn. This is a classic example. It took, I think the chess community many decades and the development of neural network engines to really understand what Bent Larsen was about. By pushing the H pawn up the board, you create the situation where you might be able to open lines and disrupt the white king. Certainly the black king is totally safe. The advance of the H pawn can only endanger the white king. And not so much in this particular position, but thematically in a lot of positions, pushing this pawn may allow things like the pawn just sinking itself into h3, gaining space and gaining a lot of end games where that pawn could potentially break through and win the end game. So this is very, very instructive. And unfortunately for white, just a few moves later, white did make a tactical error, and black managed to catch him in a bit of a puzzle-ish moment.
Yeah, I mean, this moment here at h6, g3, the queen came to c5. It's looking good for white. You have the bishop pair. This pawn d5 is isolated. Your queen just got active. But after the hg, queen e5, you have a big trouble, because this pawn g3 is under attack. If you ever push this pawn to f4, ooh, give me those light squares, even a bishop h5 or a queen
knight
h5.
g4, queen e3.
Yeah, you're just in deep trouble there, giving me such squares. So instead, the move king f2 was played, and that's walking into this nasty knight fork. Give up one knight to take back, and then that's a fork where, and look at this, didn't even take the queen. That's how you know it's a high-level player. Most of us would just take the queen, which is a great move. Instead of throwing in a check and saying, maybe I'll go checkmate your king, and that's what he does. He goes for it, and then he finally takes, gets the queen, and plays bishop d3. So a nice sequence there for black to win the game.
Very, very pretty. Of course, I think royal forks have always been one of the prettier elements in chess, especially for amateur players. It just kind of sticks together so well. The geometry is always really, really pleasing. And I think these kinds of patterns where you get a royal fork and you drop one knight in and then you lose it, you sacrifice it, and you have to drop the other knight in as backup is particularly nice in this case. Very pretty geometry, very instructive geometry.
That's right. I think many of our viewers, if you're newer to chess, you think, wait, I can't put my knight to e4 because that pawn's there. But you have to think in that trading sequence, right? One knight replaces the other, as Sam was just talking about, and that wins more material than you give up. So it's a really nice find there by Anisimov. And it all started with that h5 move, because even if we just scroll to this position, this wouldn't be an attack if there's a white pawn on h2 and a black pawn on h7 or h6. But because he went in h5, h4, and then created a softer target, the shield that the white king had was dented, and then there was a tactical sequence to win it for black. So nice game there. And, well, I mean, so many good games. We're spoiled for choice. Hundreds and hundreds of players taking part in every single round here. Sam, it's just been so fun thus far.
Absolutely. I'm a huge fan of this kind of event. I really like spectacular chess. I like these kinds of, attacking games. And I've always loved the Olympiad, the World Cup, this event right here, where you just have so much chess to absorb. Like you go in between the rounds and look at the games on Chess.com events or other locations, and you just see all these games. You're like, whoa, that's a beautiful queen sacrifice right there. That's a beautiful checkmate. That's an upset. It's just such a rich, array of chess to enjoy.
And in some extent, there may be too much to process, but you can take your time. These games are not leaving the internet. You can check them out at a later time. And, well, we'll check everybody out in a later time because we're going to take a short break. We will be back soon. And when we return, we are getting set for round 3, and the action is certainly heating up. And we're back for the FIDE Online World Corporate Chess Championship. I'm Grandmaster Robert Hess. Alongside me is National Master Sam Copeland. Sam, 2 rounds in the books. We are about to get round 3. You and I were just speaking about some of these really big matchups that we have in store for us going forward.
Absolutely. We've got some very, very even matchups. I think we have Anish GIRI has his first, nope, not his first, his second Grandmaster opponent, because in round 1, he played Nihal Sarin. That's the kind of strong event that this is. We'll be paying a lot of attention to the Optiver matchup, which will be really, really close. Last round, I think that Magnus Carlsen's Kindred team did unfortunately lose their match. Very exciting game for the world champion. But we've just got so many interesting and competitive teams to watch. We're going to take a quick look at the standings, try to highlight some of the teams here that are on top of their pool and have a good chance to qualify through on Sunday.
Yeah, we see starting in the A group, you have teams like the Bank of Russia. You have in there, even looking down past the 4 points, right? That's in first place, but Airbus from France looks pretty cool there. Amazon Europe, I've been looking at their standings. All of these teams have a chance for sure. And in Group B, we were talking about Granka from the beginning. They still look real powerful, but so does Yakovenko and Yandex there in group as the 4th team on the list there.
Absolutely. Great companies, great supporters of chess, especially Grinka. As we've mentioned, they run a super tournament every year. Unfortunately, I do believe last year's was canceled due to COVID, but we hope that they are able to bring that back in 2021. And they've got Georg Meyer and Ina Agrest, Hannah Marie Kleck, a host of great players on that team, but there is a lot of competition. And as we look at these teams as they're playing their matches, we should really be paying a lot of attention to the game points in that first column there, because that is a very, very important tiebreak. It's not just important that the teams win their matches. They also often need to get a very big score. If they potentially end up in a tie at the end of tomorrow, that will be a huge tiebreak. They need as many individual game wins as well as match wins to move on.
That's right. And Morgan Stanley there in Group C, they're taking on Wasco. So some top heavyweight matchups in store for us. And we see the rest of the standings. We have in Group D, Slav Group, I think Ilya Smirin is on the top board for them. You have PayPal Bulgaria. We've talked quite a bit about them with Ehrenberg and Stefanova on the top 2 boards. Sberbank Trade Union, we've seen from them. They have Anton Korobov. So just strong players throughout this whole standings here. All these teams are very powerful, and as we get further and further into this tournament, the teams at the top will be really fielding title players and highly rated players throughout their boards.
Absolutely. And I think we wanted to take a moment to talk about the charity side of this event. These companies, many of them have been supporting chess, have really strong ties with chess. As we talked about, some of them have been really the key sponsors of super tournaments like Grinka, like Tata Steel. Others have been, also supporting not as at an organizational level, but in terms of like funding for the World Championship and a lot of other initiatives. Here are some of the initiatives that are being supported by this particular event and through initiatives that FIDE is working on year round. They include chess and education, as FIDE is organizing seminars and support for people to teach chess all around the world in many communities that just don't have a lot of infrastructure to support chess, supplying boards, instructors, seminars, training for all of those who are working in these communities. It's fantastic. This year, we had the first FIDE Online Olympiad for people with disabilities. There was a lot of great buzz about that on social media, a lot of really fantastic chess players playing in that event. And I know that the winning Brilliancy game got a lot of attention there for that event. And finally, the FIDE Chess Veteran Support Program is an incredible initiative. Being a top chess player is really, really difficult financially. That's one of the reasons that many of the players in this event who are grandmasters, who are great chess players like Joel Laudier, have pursued a career in business because it's much more easy and stable to make a living. But through this event, working with these companies for the corporate championship here, we are able to fund events like the Veteran Support Program, where these grandmasters who did so much in their career to promote chess and play chess brilliantly have funding to help them, as they're now retired and they may not have like benefits or retirement to fall back on. That's not something that's given to a professional chess player. And it can be a challenging situation when a grandmaster is no longer able to earn a living directly from their play and their coaching.
That's that's true, and it is a very individual sport. But FIDE is doing a great job with these initiatives to try to support some of the players who may not be able to earn a stable living. And I think it's been great, and we hope to see more donations come through for the charities. And it's what this event's all about. It's of course a spot to win, trying to win a championship and then be able to go to the World Championship at the end of the year, but also to raise awareness, to raise funds. It's a great cause. And we do have a game up in front of us right now. It's the one between Jan NEPOMNIACHCHI, and he's playing a Women's International Master. So far, so good. I think that 1282 rating, that's not accurate. I don't think that
Nope.
Black has the ring just based on the setup here. This is a nice setup for Black with the pawn chains aiming at the d5 square. You got the pawn triangle. It's very solid, but it's often difficult to come up with a concrete plan, whereas White can play e4 in the very near future, open up that bishop on c1, and with the bishop pair, you want open space for those bishops.
Absolutely. And it makes me think a little bit of the setup that Magnus Carlsen selected against Anton Korobov in the prior round. Not exactly the same at all, but a very solid setup for Black, who has given up that bishop pair. It seems like maybe Jan has a little bit more to work with here, but of course, he doesn't have any significant opening advantage, and he's going to have to make something happen from this point forward. One thing maybe in his favor is at this point, his opponent is thinking and has used a minute more than him and doesn't seem to really know how to continue at this point where they've just left the opening.
And no pawns have been traded. So you can think of a capture on c4 or playing one of these pawn moves for Black, c5, e5, but there are going to be consequences with every single move made. And Queen e7, ultimately the choice. Let's not change the pawn structure. I like the triangle. I'm very solid. And if e4 happens, I'm ready to meet that. We'll have some trades that gives Black pieces more flexibility as well. And Sam, I do want to go to the game with Magnus Carlsen just to see how the opening has gone. And, well, he's clearly, and I see some donations on screen there. Thank you so much to Andre Maslach for the $10 donation. All this goes to charity. It is really appreciative of these great initiatives that FIDE is organizing. So thank you so much for that. And as you can see on the bar beneath the games there, that's how much has been raised thus far. We appreciate every single cent. But this Magnus game here, you see queen trade being offered, and Black rated 2,300 plus, strong player. What do you make of this situation, Sam?
Well, it looks to me like Black is playing very reasonably against the world champion. In round one, we saw Magnus playing very aggressively with the King's Gambit, but not so much in this particular round. The computer's indicating a small advantage here for White. That's got to be about as small an advantage as you can get with the white pieces. I don't know. I would certainly be inclined to just go equal at this point in the game. Of course, Magnus Carlsen is maybe the greatest player of all time in terms of making a small advantage into something very, very serious. But so far, Black is playing great, and it's by no means a lock here that Magnus is going to be able to win this game. He's going to have to really produce something interesting from here on to kind of convert whatever he hopes to get out of this position. I don't think that we really know right away what he's going to be able to work with. This looks very, very symmetrical and equal.
He wanted a neutral position where there's no opening theory that he could just outplay his opponent from. And what White is going to do, very likely, is push the pawn to g4, probably park the king on f2, it depends on what happens, and then start pushing these kingside pawns. And you just make the claim that I can quickly gain space. My pawns have more mobility than Black's pawns do, and that's why f3 is useful. And the knight on f6, I see this very frequently. A knight is often dominated by a pawn 3 squares away. This pawn takes away e4, it takes away g4. So what's your knight doing here? It's fine, it's solid, but it doesn't actually have anywhere forward to go. And on the other hand, White can use the f3 pawn to help push through g4. So Magnus, he has ideas. He's also now up quite a bit of time, and his camera is crystal clear.
Oh, his camera's great. I'm looking at that and like, wow. I think that many of us remember, fantastic Banter Blitz videos that Magnus has done where his camera had some glitchiness. I think some of us have seen some of those videos, but obviously right now his camera's looking stellar.
It really is. And well, we like to talk about Magnus and his games so far. Not too many moves have been played. Black thinking here. Let's go to the game between Anish GIRI and part of that Optiver matchup, where we were looking at the pairings before the round. On board 4, Optiver is just completely outraged on that board. So they're hoping that Anish can come through for them against Rossetti Volga, a very strong team in their own right. Board 4 for Rossetti Volga is 2,100 plus, and they have a grandmaster on board 1. This is a serious contender.
Absolutely. Really exciting matchup, very competitive, tough opponent for Anish, and Anish really needs to win, as you're saying, because they're very outrated on board 4. It would be very surprising if they're able to get a half point or a full point in that particular board. So they're going to need to outscore them in just 3 boards. This H5 is very interesting, and of course immediately recalls the Anisimov game where we were looking at the advanced H5. And yes, it looks like Anish is really generating some very inconvenient pressure against the white king. He has more space. This is an example of a position where the isolated pawn is conferring all of the kind of extra dynamic opportunities that you really want when you're taking on an isolated pawn.
And you can just see from Anish's previous move that knight e5 was played. And that some may say, wait, that pawn on b7, can't you capture that? Well, you take on b7, in comes this knight to c4, hitting the bishop, hitting e3, hitting b2, rook b8 next, coming down the b file. White's position is quickly collapsing.
b5? No, bishop b5 is controlled by the knight on d4. I thought we might have a chance to trap the queen. I'm not sure about that.
Oh, yeah, it's very close, actually. In the near future, rook to b8, queen's only one safe score. And if you can rook make b6. Bishop b5 or rook e or b6, one of those moves, it's so close to trapping the queen, it may, in fact, be possible. You're right, Sam. But he went rook c3, did Ilyushin, and knight c4, bishop c1. So it's kind of a sad state of affairs for white here, and Anish just keeps pushing through, like b5, b4. Let's break open the position, and your bishop went back to c1, and your pieces are awkward.
It definitely feels to me like I want to try and attack on the king side for Anish, but he's really sealing up the queen side over here. I don't know if he's going to transition to a kingside attack at some point with that queen buried on a2. It really feels like the time to make these kind of attacking opportunities work. And maybe he's headed there. It's just that he's sealing up the white queen side, and he's going to create an initiative over on the king side at some point.
And look at this move, e4. Just that's walking into black's plans. I get it. The bishop on c1 didn't look good, but after takes, now e4 is already capturable, it seems. This g4 square is black's for the taking. So I think white's king is way too exposed, and you don't have any active play of your own.
I'm kind of surprised he hasn't taken on e4 yet. There he goes. Because even though there seemed like there might be some other good options, it was hard to believe that there was necessarily a definitively better option than taking on e4 because that was so good. But wow, Anish's pieces just look so great in this position. And he's got an extra pawn. To be entirely honest, I'm not sure where the pawn was dropped. But at some point, it was on
just
e4.
Just e4.
Yeah, it was just e4. That was just a hanging pawn. That was just a hanging pawn. That wasn't a trade. Just took that.
That was free 99. And well, this bishop on g4 is now attacking the rook, the knight behind it. And that knight could even come back to e4 at some point soon. White essentially relying on, hey, can my rooks attack you? And is my queen through your knight also helping out? The answer is no. Black is safe and sound here, and white's position is falling apart, down one pawn and looking like you're about to lose more material.
Right. Anish is just making it look, almost simple against a grandmaster. It's never simple, but he's certainly making it look that way as he's just dominating the board. Really, really, incredible play. Super instructive. And he's picked up an exchange.
It's looks that easy when it's Anish GIRI doing it, but it's not that easy. A lot of what happens in chess is behind the scenes in the players' heads. They're calculating all these lines, but Anish just beat a strong grandmaster. He didn't win yet. The game is not over, but He is going to win if we're being honest, and he's doing it just quickly. He's mopping up the material, and now his king is safe. He's up a rook for just a knight, And the white king is still in worse shape. This knight comes into e3. This rook on the c file could get in at some point soon. So I think that this is a win in the bag for Team Optiver.
I think anytime you see a grandmaster get a win that, quote, looks easy, and obviously I'm the one who's saying that, what you should do is really take a close look at that play, because it's probably some of the most instructive play you're going to get to
Right.
sample. So like when Anish makes it look easy here, that's a really good cue that there were probably a lot of small moves that really deserve close attention, right? That he managed to create the opportunities, to put this pressure on his opponent, where his opponent felt so suffocated as a really, really strong player that he just had no choice but e4 in that position. Just incredible play from Anish.
Yes, and he's going to win this game. I say that with a high degree of confidence. Let's go to the matchup between Radoslav Wojtaszek and Levon Bergadzi. We saw that crazy queen sacrifice in the first round by Bergadzi. Now he has the white pieces against super grandmaster Wojtaszek, one of the best players in the world, representing Łaska from Poland, and he is the number 2 in Poland, was number 1 for a long time until Jan Krzysztof Duda skyrocketed in the rankings. And look at this position, Sam.
What happens on knight takes a6?
Knight takes a6.
Something desperado style possible in this position, like bishop takes g2?
Yeah, I'm just going to show up there. Pawn a6, rook takes c6 at Sam's point. Hey, can I just steal that pawn? And so Sam teaching everybody about the desperado. Can I just go take on g2? You took my pawn, I take yours. It seems like with the help of the engine here, there's probably some kind of rook c7 check, and your rook, if it slides to d7 to defend, which is how you want to defend, once I end up trading here, my knight can come to c5. So I don't take your bishop, just like you didn't take my knight, and I guess I can attack your rook and your bishop at the same time. You can't protect both.
Right. So what is the antidote to knight takes a6 in the position? Because I don't know.
Well, it was played. It was played. So we'll find out what Wojtaszek has in store, because that looks like you drop a pawn. And I would say that maybe you start with rook d1 check. That comes to mind, is maybe trying to trade off rooks. But it's possible as well that Wojtaszek underestimated this possibility.
I mean, I see the eval bar telling me it's equal, and I'm like, I think I have a pawn. I don't understand. So obviously there's something in the position that neither of us are picking up on at the moment, but some way must exist. Now, the big question, of course, is, does Radoslav see it? It's his clock that's running, fortunately for us.
I think that there's a change with rook to d1 check, because if you swap off a pair of rooks here and the king comes to h2, you actually just see that the eval bar is going crazy. And there's a move like bishop d5. Just like I didn't take that bishop one on g2, you can play bishop d5, and you say, wait, that's not that big a deal. Give me a check. But then when the king goes out here, this rook is under attack, needing the knight's defense. So the knight can't move. The bishop protects the pawn. And if you move the rook away, say you take on g7, you lose your knight on a6. So black is able to steal that.
And it's the rook exchange that's White's problem here, because without the rook exchange, then the rook would be defended on c7 and you wouldn't be overextended. So did rook d1 check happen in the game? And
no, I'm just making the move. I haven't looked at the game. And even here, bishop takes a4, bishop d5 looks pretty good to win back your pawn. So to return to the game, as we went through all this analysis, no, rook d1 check did happen. King h2 was played. So very smart play by Bergadzi, understanding that I can't swap on d1. I need my opponent to swap on c1, and then after the trade there, as mentioned, the bishop can sacrifice itself on a4 or play bishop to d5 once the rooks get traded, and in which case the knight will have to move and black will regain the pawn.
Very, very instructive stuff. And of course, it's very easy to probably look at this game after the fact, and it's likely to be a draw. Of course, many things can still happen, but it does look like accurate play is kind of resolving the pressure here for the black player, and to think, oh, that wasn't, too interesting. And of course, there's all these little tactics. And in this case, we're seeing them on the board with knight takes a6, which is really interesting and accurate responses from Wojtaszek. But in many cases, it might not actually be on the board, but it's still being calculated by both players. And bishop takes g2 instead of these other lines that are mentioned with bishop takes a4, bishop d5. And this is much more dynamic. And maybe Wojtaszek is actually thinking that he's trying to press and to win this position potentially by going for what looks to be a sharper line, although the computer's not really a big fan of this particular line.
Yeah, I think that black could be in some trouble if you're not careful. And the rook
Mm.
c7, the rook trade is offered, and white gets an outside pass pawn. By the way, Magnus and Anish have both won their games. Magnus winning that very quickly, considering it was a pretty neutral position. And we have an endgame now, Sam, where there could be the presence of an outside pass pawn. Black saying, if you take my bishop, I take your knight, and well, I'm going to win your pawns here. So that's off the table.
Are we
completely.
desperadoing further with knight takes e6?
I was about
E4
to
was
say
played.
that. I was about to say, can we take on e6? Because this bishop is still under attack. So you take the knight, the bishop falls, and well, that seems to win a pawn for white right there.
He didn't go for it, and I wonder if maybe maybe there was a concern that after like bishop d5, your pawns are stuck on light squares. Maybe they fall, and maybe it's the b pawn that is the most dangerous pawn on the board. In fact, definitely the b pawn is the most dangerous pawn on the board. It's just not clear if that's enough to win the game or even to confer an advantage. But I'm definitely picking the b pawn over any other pawn that white has or black has in the position.
And it's easy to stop calculation early, say, oh, desperado, that looks bad because white stole a pawn. But actually, as we keep going here, the pawn on a4 is a weakness and can be easily taken. And knights are notoriously bad at defending pawns on the other side of the board. So we saw b4, bishop c6 played, and a5. But wait a second.
The black king.
Isn't this king just coming over here to mop up these pawns?
It is certainly feeling like Wojtaszek is getting very, very serious winning chances. Very difficult for Bragazza to play at this point. I love active king in the endgame. It's just like one of my absolute favorite themes in chess. The king is, you know, it spends so much time trying to hide away. The whole point of the game is to checkmate your opponent's king. But when you're in the endgame, all of a sudden, the white king on h2, which felt safe a moment ago, now feels inactive. And that black king on d5 is feeling like an absolute hero right here. Of course, a lot is being traded. Maybe this is still drawable, but certainly black with that king on d5 is the player who's pressing. Very interesting, of course, Wojtaszek slowing down after pawn to a6, trying to figure out how he can generate the maximum winning chances in this position. Do you take on a6 when more pieces get traded, or do you allow the pawn to remain as a very kind of scary passed pawn, but maybe also a weakness?
b6 is really tempting. Where does that knight even go? It's limited. And after b6, if the knight goes back to, say, b3, already this king can come to c4 and then even try to win this a6 pawn as well after that. So I think that Wojtaszek has the upper hand right now, and he takes on a6, and even here, he's better because this pawn is going to fall very shortly. The good thing for the knight is the pawns remaining on the same side of the board. So you may lose your outside pawn, but with the pawns on the same side of the board, the knight is better at controlling those.
And that knight is jumping back very, very quickly to try and get counterplay, pick off a pawn, immediately attacking the e6 pawn. Is bishop d5 the right way to defend? Bishop d5 would allow knight e8, among other potential concerns. Bishop d7 instead, to make sure that you're controlling the e8 and e6 squares. And b4 should fall. Black should be up a pawn. Is it enough to win? Uncertain. Also, can you just trap that knight? That feels like a very serious concern.
And that's the problem with knights. I mean, bishops control them very well. King can come to b5 now, and the knight will run away to potentially c5, but this b4 pawn is falling. So after bishop c8, it just went to equal and then back up. So knight to c7 is the wrong move, even though I understand why Bragazza would play it to repeat, trying to get to e8. So bishop c8 was the mistake, right. And I don't think that Wojtaszek will necessarily repeat it after knight a6.
So what's the better move here that secures an advantage?
Could you make no idea. Could you make like a pawn move somehow? You have an extra pawn on the king side. If we cut the board on this half here, right, black has an extra pawn. So he does move his bishop back here. He looks like he's about to win this pawn, so you figured a way out. But at some point, you will probably have to push your pawns if you expect to win this game.
Mm-hmm. So some advantage with the extra pawn here. Obviously, a serious advantage. Enough to win? Unclear. It's, of course, as you mentioned, nice that the knight is defending all on one side, right? If you have an extra pawn and that pawn is over on the queen side, it's just very easily decisive. With all the pawns on one side, the knight is just much, much better equipped to defend against the bishop and to try to construct a defense on the color complex that the bishop does not control.
Right. And the pawn on h7 matches the color of the bishop in the corner. So that gives good winning chances for Radek long term. I mention this all the time. h1 queen square, light square bishop, it's a match. So if this knight thought about sacrificing himself for some pawns, probably won't work out.
Right. Black's pawns are doing a great job controlling the knight at this particular moment. That pawn is headed...
Knight g6. Can you play knight g6?
Oh.
Oh my gosh, because we take h6 happens and white wins the game. It just looked fun. I don't know if it's going to be played, but I love moves like that.
Knight g6.
It's played.
Yeah, h6 is going to be played, right? Because if you allow h6 and then knight f8, then white could potentially be winning. So do you need to go h6 immediately right here to prevent that pawn from going forward? But then could the knight go to h8 and f7?
Oh my gosh.
But I guess what Black is going bishop d7 and e8 in a hurry to attack the pawn, right? So I think h6 is necessary. The king runs back. So that's evidently sufficient.
Yes, because if h6, king d6, knight f8, king e7, you do win this pawn, but your knight is stuck. So the king comes to f7. And I mean, I'm going to trap your knight soon, especially if I get my bishop around. The knight's caught. Wow.
Beautiful, beautiful idea. Just more instructive ideas regarding the active king and the important role that the king plays in the endgame here.
Mm-hmm. And that's why Bregadze plays knight e7, only about a minute per player. Of course, Wojtaszek under that minute. He's up a pawn, but this knight is such a thorn. It's going all around. But Sam, you mentioned this earlier. We keep talking about it. That knight could possibly get trapped.
It could get trapped. It could also create some serious problems after knight g8 attacking the f6 pawn and then knight to f6. So this is very double-edged, and Black is up a pawn, and now the engine is saying that white is actually better, which is just incredible. Rashid Nejmetdinov once said that in blitz, knights are better than bishops, and I think we're feeling that here a little bit in this time scramble.
We certainly are. The pawn now cemented on h7. The bishop cannot help. Bishop e4, knight f6. You cannot push the pawn to f4 because the knight would be hitting the bishop. So you would drop your bishop on the square. And look at Wojtaszek. Down to 17 seconds. He's trying to figure this out. He probably has to bring his king. But now after knight f6 takes h7, g5 is a safe square. He does bring the king back. Knight comes back. He does do the right thing. But Sam, in a blitz scramble, this could go badly.
Right. I mean, I think that everything should be contained by Wojtaszek, but with so little time, this is incredibly difficult. Of course, as the king approaches, you feel much, much safer because you're defending on a very, very narrow front. And it is hard to see, how white can kind of force the pawn through. The pawn has gone to h7, king has gone to g7, but how do you get that pawn to h8? There probably really isn't a way.
Yeah, he took an e6.
Okay, that immediately basically agrees the draw.
Right, and it's good news now for Black that the pawns are stuck on light squares. Your bishop can come defend. If these pawns were stuck on dark squares, then the knight and the king could team up. But right now, the bishop can always come to e4 or c8, depending on what white's move is, and it seems like it's going to be a hold. But a nice game by Bregadze, who he went knight takes a6 earlier. Then he was in a bit of trouble. He worked his way out of it, and he kept a bit ahead in the clock. And I think that's really what's leading him to this result.
And of course, Bregadze's outrated against Wojtaszek. Wojtaszek, a 2,700 player, super, super strong. And Bregadze is a hero for his team here, right? They're one of the strongest teams in the whole corporate championship here. And him getting this draw against Wojtaszek is huge because he's not a grandmaster. International master obviously is a huge skill, as he's just demonstrated, but he's playing consistently against grandmasters, and he needs to perform like he just did right now. And that's exactly the kind of play and result that his team is so excited to see from him.
Yes, and well, that's a big draw from Bregadze. Still more games underway. Oh, actually, I was just clicking on this game and it ends, and that's a loss for Team Optiver, and that's not good news for Anish GIRI and co, because David Pardo-Simon, he loses with the black pieces. That is checkmate on the board, and that means Optiver could be in some trouble.
Absolutely. They are going to really depend on the final result, I guess, on board 3, if we can pull that up. Board 2 here between Karavev and Javier Alcaraz in this position. So Alcaraz has white. So Anish GIRI won. Probably they're going to lose on board 4. We don't actually know the result of that game, but okay, it's already in. It's 1-0 for Olga there. So they really, really, really need the win here from the white pieces to be able to level the score. And the computer's not loving white's position. Black has a lot of control over the dark squares. Black has the bishop pair. Black really feels like there might be some chances to create some very, very serious pressure against the opponent's king in this position.
Although,
what are you looking to play here if you're black in this position, Robert?
Well, I was going to say that black is down a pawn. So the engine may see that compensation through, but a human player is looking, wait a sec, I'm down a pawn. How do I potentially win that back? And if I can't win that back, how do I go for some kind of checkmate? Right? I'm looking at a bishop f4 in the near future, maybe a queen f4, use those dark squares that you mentioned, but maybe white will just put this rook on c6 and say, I'm trading off your attacker. Please take me. Give me a pass pawn here. I feel like white has a lot of play.
Right. And I mentioned a moment ago that black had the bishop pair, and that's no longer true. Of course, white managed to exchange that off, which seemed to make a lot of sense. I'm a Benoni player, so I love control over the dark squares, but there are a lot of pieces missing. Even a great Benoni player and proficient with the control of the dark squares like Mikhail Tal, I think, really might struggle to generate something here. And e5.
Oh, boy.
Leveraging pressure. Ooh.
Okay.
Along the 6th rank.
In comes that queen, as you mentioned. I would even consider e6 to go after the black king, but taking on d6 is the choice. And if rook c1, there's pawn d7. This is an amazing tactical sequence where you threaten to promote your pawn while taking a rook. And it looks like black is there first, but you have this cool move d7. You want to push your passed pawns. Here it comes with force. And rook d8's not the move you want to play when you've just given up your second pawn.
Nothing about the trajectory of the last several moves is something that Team Optiver wants to see. This is very, very unfortunate. Great play by white. The engine was definitely liking the black position, and every move since has really kind of converted the position a little more in white's favor, as white has exchanged off the light squared bishop, has broken through with e5, has captured on d6.
Oh, rook's hanging.
Strong pawn. And
there goes Optiver's throw. Because this is Optiver's with the white pieces, and they're going to tie this match, it seems.
That is so difficult for Anish's team. We can see Anish is glued to the screen here. We've got his camera up. We aren't able to get access to his teammate's camera at the moment, but you can see he's glued to the screen. And this unfortunately is a tied match. As you say, it's going to be very difficult for Optiver to make it through to the finals on Sunday after tying this match early in the 3rd round today with 3 more matches to go tomorrow. But I think still with 5.5, there's a shot. If they win all matches from here on out and they get really good tie breaks, they have a shot, but it's going to be very, very difficult. You get very few missteps at this point. Anish played fantastically for his team, but they were in a very, very difficult spot in all of their matches outside of Anish's board.
Wow. I mean, seriously, what a turn of events there. If we just go back a few moves even before that e5 push was played by white, it looked very complicated here. The dark square control for black, the extra pawn for white, and then this move rook c8, e5. Quickly, it's turning in white's favor. It's not just one extra pawn, it's a second. There's a pin on the 6th rank. So rook fc8, such a natural move. But as you can see by the bar, the engine bar, not totally approved. There likely was something better. Maybe it was queen f4 or bishop f4, just keeping the position a little more solid. Queen f4 makes a lot of sense now.
Queen f4, yeah.
You walk out of the pin, your queen can come into g3 perhaps, your rook still can go to c8 next move, and unfortunately for Karavayev here, walked right into it, and then e takes d6. Again, great shot because rook c1, d7 wins the game, as your rook needs to stay in front of the pawn, and then you can just take here. The liquidation certainly winning for white. Rook c6 to c8, for example.
Right. And potentially Black did see this idea of going for Rook C1, of E5, and was still going for Rook C1 and may have missed this D7 idea. I don't know if it would have worked even without D7 being possible, but that was a very nice counterpoint from White to really turn the game in White's favor. You know, we can easily focus on the Rook drop on B3, but at that point, everything was so much in White's direction. And Black needed to win the game, not just to draw the game. I think that it's a very, very well-earned match victory from the Russian team.
Right, and that eventual rook drop on b3, as you said, it was already a tough position. No time really remaining for Black, so it's a nice win for Optiver to even the match 2-2. And there's still a lot to play for, as you said, 5.5 out of 6 with relatively few teams in the pools. That will give you a chance, especially if you keep winning and then you play someone.
I need to correct myself. I said 5.5 out of 6 might do it, but I think they lost the match. They didn't draw it. So unfortunately, they were hoping to have a chance at 5.5 out of 6, but they could only get to 5 out of 6 now. So it's unlikely that Anish's team will be able to make it through. Optiver probably almost mathematically impossible for them to get to the final. I think when you lose a match in this format with as many teams as there are, I don't think 5 is going to be enough points out of 6 particular rounds to make it through. Maybe I'm wrong, and I'm basing that on prior team tournaments. And this is really, really a challenging team tournament, but I suspect you're going to need 5.5.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. And just a reminder, it's Swiss pairing. So you only get to play the teams once if you've already played. So if you're, draw a match, you don't have another chance to beat them. And well, let's look at some of the scores from the round. We saw Kindred win. They won 3-1. Magnus Carlsen led the way on board 1. He, of course, outrated his opponent greatly. And that was a nice win for the Kindred team. And Anish GIRI, we saw that one just finish. Optiver ties against Rosetti Volga 2-2. Anish wins on board 1. They have a win on board 2. And there was an upset on board 3 because David Pardo-Simon was the high-rated player, but with the black pieces against such a strong opponent like Mikhail Rodin, just one of those days.
Right. I have to, you caught it again. I had the players reversed in this particular match. So the white one was the 2-2 tie that you were pointing out. In my head, I had the result backward for Optiver in this final game. Of course, it was the upset on board 3 that led to the match tie. So very, very dramatic finish here in Optiver's match.
Yeah, there's so many different matchups going on. We're doing our best, everybody. Please forgive us if we're not focusing on your team, or if you're a fan favorite, or if you are actually working at a company. We apologize. Just countless teams going on, and we're trying to do the best we can. And Jan NEPOMNIACHCHI is doing the best he can because he won again for his team from Spare, and they beat the Bank of Russia. So it was a Russian clash, and Jan NEPOMNIACHCHI leads the way for his team.
And obviously, Jan's a huge player. There's so many good players competing for Russian companies in this event. Jan being one that's certainly going to get attention, close attention throughout this particular event. Also, Artemiev, just many, many great representatives of Russian companies competing in this event.
Well, speaking of Russian companies, Aeroflot taking part. They host the famous Aeroflot Open, which has been a mainstay of the world of chess for so long. They have different groups, and they won 4-0, led by Viadislav ARTEMIEV on the top board. So they continue to be a real force on the chess scene in positive ways. And of course, many other matchups took place. You can go to the Chess.com events page to look at standings. Of course, on Chess-Results, there will be standings there as well. And just so much to keep track of. And there's still another day tomorrow, but also more matches later because we have the Western pool starting at 5:30 p.m. Pacific time. That's tonight. And there will be more matches tomorrow, finishing out stage 1. And the top team from each group will end up playing on Sunday. So here we see the standings and we see the leaders. I don't know if there are any surprises, Sam, but the Czech National Bank there before the round was at least up top with Concentrix and others. And 3 rounds are in the books. So some of the standings will get updated as day goes on. Games are just finishing. Sam, I don't know what to make of everything we're seeing. Any big thoughts?
You know, I really didn't expect the level of matchups that we saw today, to be entirely honest. You know, this was just the first 3 rounds. Tomorrow we have 3 more rounds. And I really thought that there would maybe be more mismatches on individual boards and among the different companies that were playing, because you have, players like Magnus Carlsen, Anish GIRI, Artemiev, and there have been some mismatches, but consistently they've had really, really tough opponents. The matches have consistently, in this last round and even in round two, been very hard fought, very difficult to get a 4-0 score. And there's just going to be a ton to play for tomorrow, where in this 10-2 time control with 4 boards, there's going to be more of these examples like this Optiver versus Rossetti Volga match, where there's 1 game left and it's just a time scramble, and the entire team's fate really depends on that 1 game and what happens right there.
And there's a lot of chess talent at these companies, not just the Magnus Carlsen and Anish GIRIs of the world, but as you can tell in this Optiver match, they had international masters that work at these companies. So chess is very popular. It's played all around the globe. We love to see it. This has been a great start to this international competition for the World Championship, World Corporate Championship. That's such an honor to take part in it and to win a title, and much more is to come. We want to remind everybody one last time for now that this is also a call to action, raising money for charity. FIDE has done a great job leading the way here, and there are some fantastic initiatives where everyone can take part and give if able. So thank you on behalf of myself. Sam, it's been a pleasure commenting with you. And I guess up next, there's going to be PogChamps before more from this FIDE online World Corporate Chess Championship.
So much chess to enjoy these days. Thank you, Robert. This has been an absolute pleasure to enjoy this chess with you.